What up, everybody in YouTube world? Here's another video by a boy Efi's Voice with another live scheduled, you know what, broadcast. Alright, this video is something that I realize I've come into knowing. I've been knowing for a while, a little bit now, but I'm making a video on. Alright, here I go. Arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. People got to realize that arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Arguing can prevent you from doing things that you shouldn't do and lashing out at people in ways you shouldn't. Arguing lets you vent. Arguing lets you express yourself on things that frustrate you sometimes. Arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. A good way to argue is to argue behind people's backs. Argue behind people's back, not directly to them sometimes. That's a good way so you can avoid the drama sometimes. And you don't need to be face to face. You can argue face to face, but a, a good way to argue with people sometimes is to argue behind their backs, without them seeing it. If you have an issue with them, let it all out with you when they don't know it. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Arguing can relieve stress. Arguing can relieve stress. It can help you avoid lashing out at people. It can avoid you. It can help you to avoid being violent and stuff like that. It can help you to avoid being violent. If you argue and vent and stuff like that, sometimes you can avoid a lot of situations. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Um, you could do it behind people's backs. You don't need to do it to people's faces all the time. If you want to argue with people, you could just do it behind their backs when they don't know it, and just in a in a place where they don't see you. So just realize that arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Learn to vent. Learn to express yourselves vocally. When I say argue, just say some stuff that you may not like about them. Say some stuff that they may not like, and just stuff like that. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. It can relieve stress. It can help you from lashing out at people. It can prevent violence, and it can do wonders for you. People need to argue. At the end of the day, people do argue with each other. And one of the things people realize in life is that they argue with people and stuff like that. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. You don't need to do it in people's faces and straight to face all the time. You can do it behind their back without them knowing it. If you have issues with people and people bother you, just argue with them, lash out, vent behind their back. Let them express how you feel to them behind their back. That's a good way to argue and vent with people, and vent and argue with people without them, and they don't know it, and you could, and who's the better? You vented, you release stress, and now you good. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. You don't need to do it in front of people. You could do a good way to do it is behind people's backs without them knowing. You can vent. You can get a point across. They won't even know it, and you good. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. It's healthy for you. Let you vent. Some people do and find out is that something everybody does. You know, a lot of people. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. It can help relieve stress. It can make you sound the way you're supposed to sound. It can make you see things the way you're supposed to see things. It can prevent violence and stuff like that. So if you argue sometimes, you know, it can help you out. A good way to argue sometimes is behind people's backs, because nobody want to hear all that sometimes to people. People don't got time for you telling them off all the time. So a good way to argue is to argue behind people's backs. Vent, say what you need to say. Well, not to their face, but behind their backs, and no one's the better. And then you vented, you sound cool, and now you feel good. So arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Can really do wonders for you. It can make you sound cool. It can make you feel better. It can prevent violence. It can do wonders. It can make relationships better. It can make relationships better. Arguing can make relationships better with people and stuff like that. All right, that's the video for now. Have a great day. Learn to, arguing is good for you. Learn to argue sometimes. Peace.